Well, aside from one's own feelings about the importance of what you think and say, which I can discount, um, I think it is worth reading for those who are very interested in classical music in general, in the piano specifically, and perhaps information about the life and some of the inner thoughts of one particular artist who's had, a certain degree of success and is well known. And it's an opportunity to know the person and the thinking and the artist more specifically, which is something I would have very much liked to have done. For example, when I was much younger, and I had many artistic heroes, many of whom were pianists, and of course I read about them in interviews, but that's shorter interviews, so that was not so much in great detail. But then occasionally there would be a book about them, and that would be very fascinating to me. So I suppose it could be of great interest to a wide range of people. Well, it's a beautiful quote that I know very well. Um, yes, of course, it's a fundamental paradox that if we could speak about what music does in words, then we wouldn't need music, of course, because it is a self-sufficient and still quite mysterious process that neuroscience is teaching us more and more about where it originates, how it originates, the connections it makes. Because music, without getting too sidetracked, music obviously goes to portions of our brain and our physical anatomy and our consciousness, which is all consciousness is also not so well understood yet, although we're getting better. It seems to be a very fundamental human quality. Um, Nevertheless, just as, for example, in the Chopin competition, which happens every 5 years, almost, except for during COVID, um, or any piano competition or any musical competition, um, the objective factors are really not part of what a jury or an artist must consider. Yes, technical competence, a certain kind of rational intellectual understanding, a certain qualities of sound. I mean, we can discuss these things very, very, very much. But finally, the most important things you can't really discuss, which is both mysterious and beautiful and sometimes frustrating. I think that, but nevertheless, since we do have words and we do have our brains behind them, it's worthwhile to speak this way, not because my analysis, say, of Schubert or Chopin is definitive, but it's the analysis of a musician who spent a great deal of his time in life trying to understand these things, and it gives you perhaps an insight into one person's own Rosetta Stone with music, how they interpret these strange markings that these great geniuses have left us. And of course, the deeper aspect of fundamentally who I am, I can't do because, to quote the American composer Charles Warren, self-characterization is dangerous. But nevertheless, I cannot help, I mean, my first impulses towards sound and music were probably heard when I was inside my mother still, like all of us. So it's ultimately very mysterious why we react the way we do to what we do, why I like certain pianists, or why I got along better with certain teachers, or have more affinity for certain pieces, even of Chopin, than others, because everybody has this mysterious stew that's their own self. So I think it is worth talking about because just as you can only get to know part of me or anybody who's interviewed or written about or who is writing themselves, nevertheless, your human qualities will somehow create some kind of interaction, and maybe it will provoke something in you that's either greater understanding or greater even dislike sometimes. How can he say that? For heaven's sakes, But then you learn more about yourself and your own reactions. So anyway, now, as Camila knows, I tend to talk much too much, but that is at least a partial answer. Oh, I was very pleased with this because, first of all, as you've already noticed, I talk a lot and I talk quite fast. And it is very improvised because when I speak in an interview about music or anything, but mostly about music, I don't feel responsible the way I do when I'm on a stage playing Chopin or Beethoven. I don't have to present something that is an artistic work, so I can be quite free. So I think Camila's first problem was getting all of this written down and then editing it into some more coherent, into a more coherent manner for so that the reader would not be lost in this, hurricane of words that I can speak very quickly. And for me, the problem is I guess I do speak fast because I simply can't keep up with what's going on up here. I think many people have this problem, but somehow I try. I try to catch this bird this hummingbird that's fast, or this insect that's fast, flying very fast. So I was very pleased, in fact, to read how well Camilla had captured what I meant, and I was actually quite pleased with myself, if I may say. Some of his thought processes were coherent and meaningful, and I think had some intelligence behind them, and some appropriateness to the music, and some kind of emotional connection as well, which for me is very, very important. For me, music is emotional and visceral first. Yes, it has an intellectual component and it has analyzable components, but for me, it's really about this kind of pure feeling state. And I was actually quite pleased to read myself translated into Polish, translated back to English, understood by an author, that I read much of it and thought, yes, that's actually not bad. So that was. It's not that I had small hopes. Of course, one always has great hopes, but you don't know how it will be. And also, I have to confess personally that sometimes, a music fan or an admirer will in one city will bring to me something from the newspaper from 30 years before, written in a local interview, and they'll say with great meaning, "Oh, I've never forgotten what you said about this." And I look at this interview and I think, "Oh, did I say that really?" Help! Because when I was giving the interview in some city, I wasn't necessarily thinking that this would be some kind of testimony. I may have made a spontaneous comment, and sometimes it's good, and sometimes it's not very good. But this was I was very happy making, because also I knew when I spoke to Camilla that this might turn into a book. It's quite different than perhaps, when you go to a given city and you do an interview because the sponsor of the concert says, yes, we need to help increase ticket sales, so let's have a little publicity. So sometimes you're just, you're trying to best to get some more people into the hall. Whereas with this, I knew this would be serious, and we spent a lot of time, in fact. And as Camilla mentions, the whole big Schubert section about the big posthumous A major sonata was really quite spontaneous, because we began talking to each other as musicians after my concert. She had some questions as to how I had arrived at certain conclusions and so on. So, but that of course, with me, all you have to do is just ask the question. It's like pressing the button, and out comes a lot of words. Oh, yes. That is a tricky and very good question. Thank you. I think it does, because sometimes, well, there is I forget who said it, somebody maybe in the field of psychology, I don't know, or some wise philosopher said that it's not so important when you have a question to find the answer, but to ask the question. That begins the process of thinking about it. And very often I have discovered, even before meeting Camilla and reading my own words, that if you are asked a question by a student or by a member of the public at perhaps a master class, you're forced to actually contemplate what do I really think about this? I have a feeling, of course. Oh yes, yes. But then you also know that how can I say this about that in a way that is reasonable and communicative rather than just a personal feeling? That harmony is so beautiful. Fine, but why? And how is that? Can you communicate that? So, I think that yes, I think it informs me because we discover in trying to reveal ourselves in words to others, we discover sometimes what we think and feel, or where we sometimes have an empty space in our own ability to present it. And I think as an interpreter, that has become clearer to me over the years, that one of the great things about experienced interpreters, and I don't include myself in this, but when I hear great pianists on recordings, it seems to me that over the years, if you have time to follow the trajectory of their artistic statements as they say, as Rubinstein might record a Chopin piece 3 times in his life, or Horowitz or Rao or anything, you hear a greater inflection and personal understanding as the years go by. In other words, each note seems to have more point and meaning and more character. So I like to always say that, when we are young artists and we win the competition, all of us are criticized for playing fast and very, very loud and very well, the way you should when you're maybe 22 years old. And but very often critics say, even reasonably, but there's not much interpretive point of view or not much emotional connection. It's almost more athletic. And, but I think if you take 2 of the most individual pianists of the 20th century, both of whom I knew, Horowitz very briefly and Rao much more, who have a very heavy interpretive signature. If you listen to their young recordings, they are incredibly brilliant, and they have the DNA and the personality. But after a lifetime of thinking and doing, the relation of each note to each note gets more and more and more and more intense and more personal. So maybe in their case, in the Rao's case, I'm sure it was very conscious. In Horowitz's case, it may have been quite spontaneous. We are all different. But I think that, yes, I think trying to speak about what you're doing, at least for me, has stimulated me into trying to say, what do I really feel about it, and can I communicate that? I think that that person will lose certain things, the way I lose certain things when I read certain things, perhaps about science or things I don't understand so well. And yet, if there's sometimes, even though I can't stay with the whole thing, I can get something and enjoy very much part of the content, especially that which is personal or presented in a way that I can understand. Now, of course, with Camilla, not only can Camilla read music, but when we were having this discussion as informed musicians together with a musical context, and I knew, of course, this book was for the Chopin Institute, and it was not meant to be, it was not meant, in my understanding, to be a casual book. It was meant to be somewhat consequential. And I think that, therefore, I sometimes would dive into things, but some of the book is very anecdotal and personal, and I think talks a great deal. And I hope that some of the sections which are about music, which is a great deal of it, nevertheless, I can communicate some of my deep feelings and love for, certain works of Chopin, and then specifically how in my understanding Chopin made this certain magic happen, in his particular way at his particular time, with what I think was his understanding, both conscious and intuitive, of his own process. So maybe that will get some people to think. I mean, in Poland, of course, Chopin is better known than anywhere else in the world. But as I always say, he does belong to the whole world of music. And if there's a music lover who doesn't know much about classical music, I often hear, especially in America, well, I don't know anything about classical music. Oh, but that's Chopin. That's just beautiful. Somehow he has this formula to transcend even the intellect. And I think with pianists and with musicians, for me, what's been very important, and in my own struggle to understand music, is the fact that Chopin specifically is an extremely conscious composer. I mean, yes, of course he was a genius. We know he was a genius, but what does that mean? That's so oh, he was a genius. Well, yes, everybody's a genius. but to understand how very precisely he made his works of art and actually struggled in this very conscious way. And I think that only increases our admiration and understanding for him, and for the pianists and for the musicians who will therefore play these pieces. Maybe it can help them find a way into what they like rather than something general. I don't know, but I think that yes, it ultimately does become that one is frustrated in words. One can explain and explain and explain, and finally, if you can sing a phrase or show a rhythm or a feeling by tapping or dancing, as you say, that is really what it's about. And unfortunately, we can't do that in literature, in a book form. We can't do that. But it's still, because it's a book about me, written by Kamila, in which we're trying to dive deeper into music, that sometimes when the music erupts because it has no choice, that's lovely. But at least in the chapter, you'll understand. You can look at that little eruption or that musical quotation of that beautiful section, and then you can go back and read about how you can go backwards. So I hope it's enjoyable and helpful. Okay, I'll just risk one thing. The opening of a piece, of course, I love the F minor piano concerto. The first four bars say so much. Of course, I can't hum. I will attempt to hum, but I can't hum with any of the harmony involved. But this shows you so much about the character of the person and how he writes, that is specifically himself. He begins ba-bum, ba-bum, with this concerto militaire idea. Ba-bum, ba-bum. Okay, that's confident, but it's in the minor. And then immediately there's chromatic, wah, 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 depressive chromatic sliding down. And then the melody joins it in the second bar and gets dragged down. Ba-dum, ba-da, da, 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 da. We're getting to the melancholic inner side. But then, yum, ba-bum, ba-bum, the concerto militaire idea reasserts itself, but then yum ba-dum ba-dum bum ba-da, and he does a non-melancholic but still minor formal Mozartian semi-cadence. Wow, it's a lot going on here. And I think I just had the pleasure of playing with a very good conductor, Daria Stasevska, who the Ukrainian conductor who grew up and lived in Finland. I just played the F minor with her in Paris, and I didn't know her. And I said, the thing about this opening is that it mirrors, and now please, I'm not trying to play to my local audience, but it happens that I am. It mirrors that Slavic or Slavonic character of temperament, which is constantly shifting between emotional ranges. It's not sort of a steady thing. Of course, Chopin could write steady when he wants to, and Beethoven and Bach could write emotionally volatile music when they wanted to, and certainly Mozart could. But it's very so typical that he brings this characterological element, because Chopin is the first great outside European composer, not from the main countries, from a very foreign and exotic land at that time. But he sort of puts his cards right, it's there for anybody to hear who understands. And yet it's not dramatic, it's not big. He's not saying, look at me. This is just, he's writing this music, and it shows you his musical and emotional DNA.